Thanks to the Berkeley crew, Adam, Delia, Alex, Lanique, and all of the Cooley people, we're thrilled to be able to kick off today with such an important conversation. And I just have to say, being part of the world's greatest public university and with such an important law firm that's willing to talk about difficult, important issues, it's just a really special day. For those of you who end up watching this on record, it's the day after the election, and I just have to show you, you have this, but if you're just watching right now, you should go out and buy this, click buy on the white wall. It's just an incredible book, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Emily. I'm sure you've read multiple bylines from Emily Flitter. She's been a journalist for a long time, for the last 5 years at the New York Times, and she has the beat of covering basically the intersection of banks and society. Your title is, what is your actual title?
It's the impact of finance on society.
The impact of finance on society is actually her job description, and this is an incredible book, and we'll get into the details about it. But I just wanted to start by asking you what the reaction has been. The book was just published very recently, so tell us about what it's been. First book, you're out on tour. What's the reaction been?
It's been really incredible. I've been getting a lot of notes from readers I don't know who have experienced things similar to what I describe in the book, and they've been saying things like, I feel validated, and you've described my life, my interactions with banks. I'm hearing from people who are Black who work or did work in the industry who are also feeling like the stories in here are familiar. And I haven't heard from too many banking industry folks, but I'm looking forward to continuing a conversation that started, when I started covering this back in 2018, 2019.
And some of them may be here, they may be in the audience. Sources, if you're interested in talking to a reporter, Emily is at the epicenter of this conversation that people are having, a difficult conversation about banks and race. We're in San Francisco, not Wall Street. Is the problem that you've identified, do you think it's unique to New York and Wall Street, or is it a national problem? Is it something that's true about this area right here? Should we feel differently because, no, we're woke, we're in San Francisco, we're different? What do you think? Is it a national problem or is it a New York problem?
It's a national problem. It is a really consistent problem across the country, and it doesn't matter what the politics of the place are. And the reason for that is that the people who don't have to experience this, people who are white or look white and can interact with banks and work for banks and have other parts of the financial services system work for them the way they are advertised, don't know what it's like for people who can't get those consistent and smooth services. So it's a huge problem, and it is invisible to, a majority of people.
Okay, so the book's about customers and employees. Can we go back and tell us how you got started on this and sort of what the first story was and how you initially became the reporter on sort of the intersection of banks and race?
So it's actually really interesting. When I got to the Times in December of 2017, the question for the finance reporters was, where are the Me Too stories in finance? And we all already know in our popular culture the reputation that Wall Street had for treating women poorly over decades. The boom boom room is a term that people are familiar with. And yet we weren't seeing the sort of like outpouring that we saw in Hollywood and in the media industry, in the TV news people. And our editors were like, you guys should like sit down and figure this out. Why is there sort of not a catharsis? So I started to call lawyers who represent people who work on Wall Street who, have a grievance against their employers and ask them, like, what kinds of stories do you have? And one of them was a woman in Chicago, Linda Friedman, who has sued every bank that you can think, a big name bank, for discrimination. And she said, look, you guys are looking at the wrong thing. I mean, yeah, women have struggled and they've been making some progress. real problem that is so intractable is racial discrimination against Black employees. And you guys just don't want to focus on that. And I was like, okay, hit me with some stories. And the first story that that she knew about, which I actually had heard about kind of separately from her as well, was one of a Morgan Stanley manager who was Black.
I should say I worked at Morgan Stanley in the mid-1990s, so
okay. Disclaimer.
It's okay. Disclaimer. I'm not part of this story, just to be clear.
A Black Morgan Stanley manager named John Lockett, and he was suing the bank for racially discriminating against him. He had been hired during a time when Morgan Stanley was actually under a monitorship after settling a racial discrimination class action brought by wealth managers who were Black, who were saying, we are being shunted into poor neighborhoods, we're not being allowed to take part in the same opportunities that white wealth managers at Morgan Stanley are, and this is a pattern. And so Morgan Stanley settled, an independent monitor was appointed, and then things kind of a little bit got better for Black employees at Morgan Stanley. John Lockett was hired. The monitorship ended. John Lockett's performance reviews went pew. They started telling him things like, your employees are afraid of you. And he was like, what are you talking about? I've been here for years. I don't have any problems, and you can't give me a single example. The thing about Lockett's case, though, was that there was no cartoonish, name-calling thing that a lot of people are still looking for when they look for racial discrimination proof or evidence. And nobody wanted to write about him, including me. I never wrote about his case. But after I started hearing about so many others, I realized that there was a big problem, and that these individual cases, while they might mean one thing as individual cases, added up to something huge.
Why did you not write about his case? Were there not facts that popped for a New York Times front page story, or were there other reasons why?
It was the sort of like he said, she said nature of it. It was like Morgan Stanley was claiming that he was a terrible employee and deserved to be fired, and he was claiming that he wasn't, and he had his performance reviews, and they had their, pieces of criticism that they had lately written about him and were holding up as true. And the real breakthrough for me came when I met an employee inside one of these big banks, JP Morgan, who recorded everything. And there was no question of what had happened to him. And then everything changed.
And once you reported on that, is that when the floodgates opened and you started getting calls from every part of the country and bank, employees and customers of banks, or sort of, when did the floodgates open in terms of you're hearing these stories and them all coming to you?
It was with this employee who recorded everything. His name is Ricardo Peters. He's out of the industry, even though, JP Morgan, after his case became public, after I wrote about it, engaged with him, the two sides reached a settlement. His U5, which is the disclosure form for wealth managers who are fired, that says that they were fired for cause, has been wiped clean. And I have hours and hours of recordings that he shared with me that show his boss saying racist things, and then they show, and this was really important, how the bank handled when he filed a discrimination claim, how they gaslit him, how they said that the claim had been filed on a date 3 weeks later than what it was really filed on, and how he was taken into the basement of a Chase branch in Arizona, and interviewed by two people who never gave him their last names, who were from JP Morgan's Global Security and Investigations team. And they said, don't worry about the discrimination complaint, someone else is going to handle that later, but tell us about this other issue, which is then the pretense that the bank used to fire him instead of addressing his discrimination claim.
So there are a lot of these kinds of stories of internal investigations and the involvement of lawyers at banks, and also lots of plaintiffs' lawyers who are bringing these cases. We have a lot of lawyers here and a lot of lawyers watching. How has your view of lawyers changed as you've done the reporting and written the book?
Well, I don't think anybody, whether they've read the book or not, who's a lawyer, especially for a big financial firm, is going to be surprised to hear that the big firms spend a lot of money and have a lot of the best minds in the field working on making sure that they have the least amount of liability possible, and that there's no evidence in cases where there's a claim that somebody was mistreated. And once the bank were to admit something, if they ever did, the floodgates would open. And I think banks and any big firm, what I found is that they operate in a way that just protects them. That's what they do. And for this issue that is so deep in our American society, racism, that has a devastating effect on the victims of racism.
And so, so we have kind of two very different groups of people that you've learned about, the plaintiffs' lawyers and that group, and I want to ask you about that. But what would you tell the lawyers inside institutions? Financial institutions obviously are the focus of the book, but just in general, based on what you've learned over the last few years, what would you tell people inside institutions about how they should be thinking about race?
Well, one of the things that I learned as a journalist is that when we are trained to sort of start out from a position of what we think is neutrality on this subject, our own biases are so invisible to us and strong that we end up sort of like weighting different facts that come from different sides of, a dispute in a way that doesn't really reflect the lived experience of the people who are complaining about discrimination. If you're Black and you work in a firm and you're so desperate for a change that you actually say something to the firm, it shouldn't be treated with the same skepticism by white lawyers. And me as a journalist, I was just like, I just didn't know, I just kind of thought everything was equal, and it's not. The amount of courage that it takes to say anything about this is huge.
So for the financial institutions that you got to know pretty well, what can you tell us about how senior management viewed these issues versus the people sort of interacting day to day at a branch or who are involved in employment issues? How do you feel now that you've done all this reporting about senior management of these institutions?
I think that senior bank leaders across the board they really, really don't want to face the facts of how bad things are. I spoke with senior executives at banks who said, "Oh, this is terrible, but we have 250,000 employees, and of course we're going to have some bad apples." Whereas, at the senior ranks, there are so few Black people and women. There are more women than there are minorities, but even so, I mean, I think it's just really hard for leaders to conceive of what is happening across their institutions. But then also, by the time you get to the top leadership of a bank, you're just really good at like trying to hang on to power and circle the wagons, and you hate criticism, and we've just got this problem that's so sticky because there are a lot of people who just don't want to kind of reflect.
And so as you've had these conversations with so many different people about these issues, obviously you talk to a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers. Some of my best friends are plaintiffs' lawyers. What did you learn about plaintiffs' lawyers and the role of lawyers on the other side in all of these cases? What are they like? What do you think about them? Give us a feel for what it's been like to get to know all these people and hear their stories.
Linda Friedman is a character in this book. She's at Stoll Friedman in Chicago, and like I said, she's sued like all of the big banks for racial discrimination. She did the McReynolds case, which ended in a $150 million settlement for the plaintiff against Merrill Lynch, Bank of America. She is relentless, and at one point I said, "Linda, I don't understand why you keep doing this because nothing seems to change." And she said, "You're wrong. When I started, there weren't enough black employees at a particular Wall Street firm, any particular one, to form a class. Now we can form a class. And that's the progress. And I think that's just a really good indicator of her both dedication, but also acknowledgement that baby steps are all we can really see as progress. So I've learned a lot from talking to her and seeing how she handles these cases. And the things that don't make it into the press are when some of these settlements occur and all the members of the class come in and get a chance to say in front of a board of mediators or in front of a judge what happened to them. That some people in the industry, some plaintiffs' attorneys experience what Linda has, where you have every single member of a class who wants to come in and tell a story, and some of the stories are about gaslighting and devastating things that are so bad that they've lost their spouses or they've lost their houses. That's what the people who do this kind of work see, and I also think that they are bitter that there's not more attention being paid to this.
When you get that kind of a story and these impassioned narratives that are so full of allegations and facts and brought with such emotion, and you hear that as a journalist, and then you hear whatever you can get as a journalist from the other side, how do you weigh the sort of credibility of all the people who you're talking to over time? Because you have so many different conflicting stories, obviously, that are part of litigation, but are also just part of the way people live their lives, where they think so differently about facts. How do you approach that as a journalist, where you hear such conflicting narratives?
Well, I think that I haven't had a time when I felt like the bank is coming back and saying, look, we have a just completely different view of this and we can prove it. And there have been plenty of people who have offered me stories and I've been like, okay, I'm not going there. This doesn't make sense. I agree with the explanation that you got. I mean, I'm not saying like I believe everybody who walks in the door. But the people who walk in the door, who tell me what they've experienced and show me, and I can, call their coworkers and hear the same thing from coworkers, or they're, if they contemporaneously told a relative or whatever. I mean, I corroborate everything. And then when I go to the institutions and ask them what's going on, I get a lot of like, okay, this was unfortunate, but we like looked into it and we didn't find any intention, or it's not. They're really like, the closer you look, the more you don't even have like one matching set of explanations for every allegation. I mean, that's what makes these stories so compelling, is that once you take the time and you open yourself up, you really find a lot of like deep, undeniable pain and hardship that people have experienced, that the institutions have spent a lot of time just trying to sort of like nickel and dime away. Not say like this person is lying, just say like, oh, well, this little thing happened because of here, and here was an error, and we're so sorry about this other thing. You know what I mean?
So at a point you had to close the narrative of the book and stop reporting and get this thing out, right? But a lot has happened since then, including some sort of big picture events that you've had a chance, I know, to reflect on. And I wonder if you could tell the audience a little bit. We've got the Supreme Court affirmative action cases, and we've had, obviously, an ongoing conversation about broader issues related to race. Could you just sort of reflect on what you think, sort of what else would have gone in the book if you were still reporting and thinking about kind of these big issues that have happened in the last several months? Just reflect on that for a little bit.
Well, this book, there needs to be more done on this subject, and like much more. I mean, I could have written an entire book just about the insurance industry. I think what we've seen over the past few months, and especially with the Supreme Court affirmative action case pending, is that we're seeing the racial progress narrative still having a huge hold over our public discourse. The idea that things were bad before and Black Americans were mistreated earlier, but now things are fixed, is something that I dealt with in the book. And I think we've just continued to see examples of how things are not fixed. In the financial services industry, I mean, there are just continuing stories that come out that are like the ones in my book, and they're newer.
You mentioned the insurance industry. What are the main takeaways or highlights, without ruining the book for people who are going to read it? What was surprising to you that you learned about the insurance industry?
The insurance industry, here's something that isn't in the book. The insurance industry formed a committee on race. It was the NCOIL, the National Council of Insurance Legislators. Those are the elected state officials who make insurance law. Because as everybody here knows, insurance is not regulated by the federal government, it's regulated by states. So NCOIL formed a committee on race in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered. And the first thing that they did was not to say, hey, let's build a framework for looking at our industry and seeing how it doesn't treat Black Americans like it treats white Americans. Their first order of business was to define the term proxy discrimination in the narrowest fashion, because like everybody admits that the outcomes of insurance policy and claims activities are disparate. They do not happen the same way. If you buy an insurance policy and if you file a claim and you're Black, you're not going to get the same treatment. And they wanted to make sure that that insurers weren't going to get dinged for things that they didn't feel like they were doing intentionally. And that's huge. I mean, they were basically admitting that there are two realities for people. I found that the treatment that some Black claimants were getting seemed completely intentional. I described that in my book, and I think we just need way more focus from regulators at every level on how insurers are treating their customers.
So we had a brief conversation about what we were going to talk about. We didn't. I have some notes here, but there's really not. I haven't really asked you the questions we initially planned to talk about. But one of the things I suggested to you was that it might be interesting for you to watch this episode of Atlanta. So I don't know if people have watched the television show Atlanta, but in season 3, episode 4, there's a treatment of this idea of what if we actually did reparations. And I thought it was an interesting episode, and I mentioned it, and I think you mentioned yesterday that you watched it. Okay, so we haven't talked about this at all, but I'm curious what you thought about that, because a big chunk of the book, and especially towards the end of the book, there's a discussion of reparations and what might be appropriate, and it's very much, it turns from narrative to very much policy focused and a set of recommendations. So I wanted to ask you first, just you watched it, what you thought of that episode, and then I want to kind of have the broader conversation because you have some interesting ideas about reparations. So yeah, so what'd you think?
Okay, it's interesting that we're talking about watching the episode before we talk about what I recommended. Do you mind if I just give the audience a little taste?
No. Do it. Yeah, okay. Go ahead. Yeah, that's a better idea.
So when I started writing this book, I was asked by the publisher, please don't just write a book about what's happening. You have to put some policy, conclusions forward. And I think when my editor and I were talking about it, we were I didn't have any ideas, but she was sort of thinking maybe we could figure out how HR could be changed, a small thing. Well, I don't think that there's any way that we could continue doing what we're doing with how Wall Street treats its employees, how banks treat their customers, I don't think we can fix this problem simply by making small tweaks to HR or anti-racism training or whatever. And what I think that financial institutions of all sizes and shapes should do is support reparations and lobby in favor of reparations, a federal program that the federal government pays for that is a holistic truth and reconciliation and repayment for slavery, for
And just to pause on that briefly, your proposal is different from some others because you wouldn't have any banks or the private sector paying. So, there's sort of two big puzzles about this. One is who pays, one is who receives the money, right? But in terms of your proposal, you're talking about a sort of broad taxpayer-supported federal government program.
Right, the only thing
But
banks
linked
would,
to the banks, related to the banks, right?
the banks would help by spending, by really committing to supporting it and lobbying in favor of it. So their expenditures would be spending the money to get Congress to do it. And banks have really sophisticated lobbying operations that are very powerful. And CEOs, including Jamie Dimon, Larry Fink, they see themselves as the stewards of big ideas, big policy ideas. And if they threw their weight behind this, I think it would really make a big difference.
Has anyone reacted positively to it yet? Or what do you think the prospects are for this idea?
I would love to hear what the industry thinks about this. I think it would be great for them because they would, if reparations were paid out, they would have more customers, and hopefully by lobbying about it and by having to explain to their customers, their employees, and to the general public why they support reparations, they would be able to bring about the cultural change that we cannot bring about by making small tweaks to HR and anti-bias training and all the things that they periodically announce that they're doing that don't really make a difference. So just getting back to the Atlanta episode.
So what you suggested and your policy proposal is very different from what happens in this TV episode. So what did you take away from watching this?
Well, it was really interesting because it focuses on a man who's white who is kind of a sad sack at the beginning. Like he's lonely, his wife kicked him out, he's got some cubicle type of job, and then all of a sudden he gets sued by a woman who has proven that her ancestor was enslaved by his ancestor, and he feels like his whole life is falling apart. And then at the end of the episode, he's a waiter and he's having to give like a percentage of his salary to her and her family, and it's it's full of anxiety. Also, the episode ends with a scene where he's a waiter in a restaurant, and it's a fancy restaurant, and most of the customers are black, and they're having a great time, and actually it's that's a very positive ending. But when I watched it, I thought, okay, this is actually the angst that this guy that is feeling that's being depicted is kind of like what it was like when people tried to sue big companies and say, I found that I can trace my own family history back to your predecessor's history of financing slavery or insuring slaves. And I actually, in my book, I followed a woman who did this research and found that Aetna had insured her ancestors who were slaves on behalf of their owner, which is such a wild thing to say out loud. And she went to law school and specifically to sue big companies for reparations. And the only claim that was allowed to go forward in federal court, and she ran out of money and couldn't pursue it, was the idea that these big companies have never explained to the public how they related to slavery and how they profited from slavery, and that omission is a fraud on consumers. So I think that's really interesting, but these companies have had these people pursuing them and saying, you owe me, and companies, we have such an amazing legal industry in this country. Everybody hired the best lawyers, and they shut this down. And so we have to get to a place where we have a program that's not going to trigger that reaction in the same way that at the Atlanta episode was basically representing sort of the angstiest possible formulation for the reparations conversation.
I knew you would have an interesting take on it, which is why I asked you to watch it, and it's fascinating. And this is a conversation that we're all having. It's part of the fabric of society now that we're talking about in a very serious way, and no one is informing us with as many facts on the ground and hearing as many stories as you are. So it's an amazing book, so congratulations on it. And all of us will be reading Emily Flitter for a long time in the New York Times, and I hope that you read the book and take all these issues seriously. So thank you for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.